This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
And this is Matt Thompson with Socure.
And this is Jordan Burris with Socure.
Today, we're going to talk about identity verification. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. We have two guests today. Our first guest is Matt Thompson. He's the Senior Vice President and General Manager of Public Sector Solutions for Socure. And we also have Jordan Burris, Vice President and Head of Public Sector Strategy for Socure. But first, I would be remiss if I didn't tell the audience that we are recording this at Ford's Fish Shack in lovely downtown Ashburn, Virginia. Why here? I think everyone listening knows that 70% of the world's internet traffic flows through Ashburn. What better place to talk about identity verification than right here? Maybe it flows right through the restaurant here. Maybe through the very, very kitchen. Who knows? So we're going to talk about identity management and everything else. But before we begin, I have to tell about goals in life. I talked to Matt before the show. He tells me that his goal in life is to have a beard as good as Jordan's. Is that true?
That's very true. That's very true.
It's about time we finally admitted it.
I admire it every time we're on a Zoom call together.
And I don't want to pick on Matt, but also it's his birthday today.
That's right.
Birthday.
Yeah,
Thank you. Something here. Yay. We have his all entourage talking about it.
And it always corresponds with Identity Management Day, which is a thing that we celebrate as well. And it's kind of like Captain America having his birthday on the 4th of July. Matt Thompson has his birthday on Identity Management Day.
Captain America, who doesn't have a beard quite as nice as Jordan. But anyway, we won't talk about this one. So let's talk about identity management. Now, I tried to find a hook for this interview, and I searched, I did research, I went to Gartner, I listened to videos, I saw Jordan, he's all over YouTube. If you want to say Jordan's all over YouTube. But then it dawned on me, it's Simon Sinek, it's why. So why am I interested in this? Well, the why is very obvious. It's tax time. I just had to write a big check to the government. I gave them a big chunk of my money, and guess what? According to CNN, $5.4 billion small business loans are questionable Social Security numbers. They may not get that money back. Hey, that's my money. That's Jordan's money. That's Matt's money that's going out there. So I'm very interested in identity verification because I don't want my money wasted. I don't think anyone wants this money wasted. So why do you work for Socure? What's your motivation? What's your why, Matt?
Yeah, my why is to improve the trustworthy access to digital services, whether that's across government agencies or in the commercial space. I think we have a fundamental right to control our identity information, how it's used. And I think today a lot of the solutions in the market don't do a good job of protecting our identity. I think there's an opportunity to help government agencies in particular improve the way that people assert their identity to them to access their benefits and services, as well as the flip side of what you were saying is the manipulation of your identity information and having that used by criminals, cyber criminals, identity fraudsters to use your information to commit crimes via identity fraud with benefit programs that ultimately impact you as well.
So, Jordan, how do you ask the Simon Sinek question? Why? So why Socure?
For me, it's really about, it's a spin on what Matt was talking about, and it's about confirming that everyone, regardless of race, socioeconomic background, et cetera, has the opportunity to engage in a digital ecosystem. Far too often, and going back in my career, back in 2018 when I used to work for the government, there was a push, an initiative to find different ways to bring people and verify who they were online. Why? Because we found that far too often the underserved populations were those that were being left out of the process. Fast forward to the pandemic, this hit mainstream where you were hearing it time after time on every benefit program that folks were not able to get access to their benefits, while fraudsters coming from nation states or criminal rings were intercepting those benefits in particular. For me, something had to change, and so I joined Socure because I believed in the product and what we are doing to transform really what is that digital experience for the American public.
Matt Thompson, it's rarely that I get breaking news at a restaurant. Breaking news. I have a press release in front of me. Zero Trust Maturity Model version 2.0 released this morning on your birthday.
Yeah.
And you look into the old little table of contents here, and what's the first pillar? Identity. So I guess we're playing to your hand here, aren't we?
Yeah, no, I think there's a reason that identity is the first pillar of the Zero Trust strategy. Now, while that specifically focuses more on the enterprise side and really has a focus on authentication, at the end of the day, I think the government has a responsibility to extend their thinking around identity to meet citizens where they are. And the Biden administration has improved customer service as one of its top initiatives, and digital identity must be included in that effort. From my personal experience, my work experience, a more trustworthy digital identity system is a top priority to restore Americans' faith in their government, and I think that plays in with the broader philosophy around zero trust.
Jordan, I'm very, very sophisticated and a high intellectual, and so to do research for this, I went to Google and typed in identity verification. And a strange name popped up, the name of Jordan Burris. And I see this guy all over YouTube talking about identity verification. And also there's an article here that you wrote, and it's called From Money Mules to Synthetic Identities. I had never seen that phrase before. So what is a synthetic identity anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. So synthetic identity it falls under two different buckets, right? It is identities that in some way have been manufactured such that they can perpetrate being a real person at the end of the day. It plays on one of the legacy links in the chain, if you will, that exists for identity today. The reality that we're still, as a society within the U.S., very heavily dependent on what is the credit ecosystem in order to assert or establish someone's identity. Think of it as like the gatekeeper, ultimately. And synthetic identities are created when you have either someone's real PII, so what combination of their first name, their last name, their address, and their social security number. Someone may decide to change a piece of that, right? They may change the social security number that originally, links to Jordan into either what would be someone else's social security number or what could be, in some cases, a complete fabrication where they're just making up a person that doesn't exist. The way the credit ecosystem works is that, the first time you go to assert this information, they have to keep a record of it. Now, you may not get approved for that credit card, but if you keep coming back enough times, eventually you'll come through, because from a history standpoint, they're now realizing that someone is trying to assert who they are. And this quite often can impact, for an example, folks who are newer to the country who are coming and they're now just getting this their identity information promulgated through systems in particular. So with synthetic identity, whereas it's been around for decades now at this point, it's hitting mainstream because of the ease of access that fraudsters have to data that's been breached time and time and time again, and really these weak links in the chain, as we say, the credit over-reliance in the credit ecosystem, which has put us in this position where, give it enough time, give it enough resources, any fraudster can start to grow what is a synthetic identity and use it. Funny enough, we actually put out a report not too long ago about synthetic identity and really the state of it, and we found out that one of the most common synthetic identities that exist is an individual named Michael Smith, mid-30s, lives in Texas, has a Gmail account in particular, has a pretty average credit profile in terms of what he's doing at the end of the day, but in reality is completely fabricated and quite often used for whether it be moving money nefariously or intercepting benefits from citizens that need them most.
John, if I can add just quickly, synthetic identity fraud, is a more sophisticated type of fraud that we have seen traditionally in financial services. And what makes it also unique is the fact that it's victimless. So there's no actual person that's being notified that, a fraud event has taken place. We are starting to see spikes in synthetic identity fraud across government use cases, so I do think it's an important thing for government leaders to be more educated on and understand the problem so that they know how to solve it.
In the article that Jordan wrote, he talks about knowledge-based authentication. And I put that in the back of my mind. I'm thinking about rolling around, and I'm trying to describe Socure. I mean, if I was on the Metro tomorrow and someone said, well, what's Socure all about? Or if you're on the Metro tomorrow and someone's... would you say it's like a predictive analytics platform where it could get a lot of different information and say, yes, it is in fact Jordan? Is that what you do?
Yeah, that's part of what we do. I think there's more than one piece to it. The first piece that we talk about is the identity verification piece, or identity proofing, which is where we're making sure the identity elements that are being submitted correlate to a real human being. I often say a carbon life form, that this data, all this data matches a real person that, by the way, is still alive. One of the key things that we've seen across government fraud is a high likelihood of fraudsters using deceased people's SSNs. And surprisingly, that's happening from family members. So, I have a parent who's deceased. I'm using their SSN as part of applying for benefits. So they're applying for benefits with deceased people's information. So we want to make sure, one, it's a real person, two, that person's alive, because if they're not alive, hello, why are they applying for a government service or benefit? But that's only half of the equation. And the other half is making sure that it's actually John Gilroy who's entering John Gilroy's information. That's actually the harder part, and why that's harder is because all of our data has been breached n number of times at this point, constantly being breached, and one of the impacts of all these data breaches and ongoing data breaches is the fact that it's easy for fraudsters to get access to our data and submit all of your real identity, all of your current identity elements. What's the harder thing to solve for is this actually that person submitting it? And so that's where we get into the predictive aspects of our platform, which really focus on the different types of identity fraud. Third-party identity fraud, synthetic, which we just talked about, and we're moving more into first-party identity fraud as well.
So, Jordan, I mentioned this Zero Trust Maturity Model, version 2.0 from CISA released this morning. Believe it or not, there's also an executive order released just for John Gilroy, and it mandates me to say artificial intelligence at every podcast. So I don't have a choice. I got to say artificial intelligence. So when I think of what your job is, I think of artificial intelligence. I'm thinking, now if I'm trying to break into Jordan's account here, I can probably use artificial intelligence and maybe come up with a password or something. And so how is artificial intelligence being used to compromise credentials?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're thinking about identity in particular, fraudsters at scale are using artificial intelligence or machine learning in particular in order to beat what would be, for example, bot detection attacks or bot detection mechanisms within systems as they're submitting information. They're using it to input information into forms at a quick clip. They're learning where there's weaknesses inside of processes that exist for the government today, and they're taking all of this information, all this feedback that they're getting, and they're sharing it across their networks. At the end of the day, if you go to the dark web or you go to forums where fraudsters are living, they're telling the story of what attack was successful where and how they were able to exploit funds. That's why we see news stories out of Maryland, for example, with SNAP benefit programs of folks having their accounts intercepted in particular and then not being made whole ultimately. A lot of this comes from using technology, as it were, in order to augment their capacity and help them do things at scale faster. And unfortunately, we haven't seen necessarily the complement on the other end of the spectrum, which is where, from our standpoint at Socure, we're leveraging machine learning to fight back ultimately. So we're using the same type of tools to find a way in which we can better analyze identity as it is being as a transaction is taking place, as someone is engaging within a digital channel, so that way we can have that level of assurance that they are who they claim to be ultimately.
Matt, this is not your first time at the rodeo. You've seen a lot of things, and I think
I like to stay on the bull for longer than 8 seconds. So.
Maybe do that at your birthday party.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, I don't know. There's 135 agencies, and I would bet that there's 135 different identity solutions out there, maybe more. I mean, and each agency has little nooks and crannies, and they're small and everything else. Man my age doesn't like to say the word legacy identity verification systems, but... So I'm trying to figure out where you fit in with this multiplicity of approaches to identification. And so where does Socure fit in? Can it help just the novices? Can it only help the high-end people? Or where do you fit in this whole solution to the government?
Yeah, well, for starters, it is a problem that every agency is kind of doing their own thing, if you will. And you're the same John Gilroy when you go to the IRS as the same John Gilroy when you go to Social Security Administration. The same John Gilroy when you go into HHS. So you shouldn't have to be re-verifying that you're still the same John Gilroy and proving all the same information over and over again. That said, there's also not a one-size-fits-all approach to identity verification. I mean, if you're just accessing, some weather information at NOAA, you shouldn't need to have the same level of vetting as if you're filing your taxes or claiming your refund at IRS. So, there's different levels of vetting in the identity space. It's called assurance. But at the end of the day, there needs to be flexible identity solutions that can verify lightweight aspects of your identity all the way up to your full legal identity in every aspect, correlated to get back to that really strong proofing event that we talked about earlier. The way we fit in, and we don't solve the entire digital identity problem. What we solve specifically is around those two pieces that I shared earlier, which is this a real human? Living would be good if they're applying for benefits or services. And is it that person that's submitting the information? So identity proofing, identity verification, relatively synonymous, as well as the identity fraud piece. And we do that empirically, more inclusively, more accurately than other solutions in the market. And we think it's time now for government to put best-in-class solutions in place in this space because of all the challenges that we had during the pandemic.
Jordan, we're recording this in a restaurant, so I got to ask you a question about gourmet cooking. My avocation is gourmet cooking, believe it or not. Yesterday, I cooked dinner at the house, and I got a bunch of ingredients and called for some white wine. So I went up to the Safeway in Leesburg. This is true. This literally happened yesterday. And I'm an old guy with gray hair. I can barely walk. And so I went up to buy this thing, and the woman said, "Okay, I want to see your ID." "What do you mean? You take out my wallet and show you my ID? Really?" She said, "Yes." I said, "That's it." I threw my hands up, and then I walked out. I said, "That's it. I can't take it." And I walked away. Okay? Now, there's a parallel in the federal government. Let's say Claude Jennings Jr. works for the federal government. Let's just say, pick out a name out of a hat somewhere. And he goes through multi-factor authentication, There's something called MFA fatigue, where Claude says, I'm sick of it. I'm just going to let you through. I'm sick of it. It's so you get the point where, so where's the net under that, All of a sudden some malicious actor can get in because of MFA fatigue. And so the fail-safe is identity verification. Is that what it is?
So it's about understanding that there's different parts of the problem in which things can go wrong, right? Like a lot of the focus and conversation around the federal government today, or even historically, has been around multi-factor authentication. And don't get me wrong, that is an important piece of the puzzle. It is absolutely necessary, and more importantly, moving towards phishing-resistant authenticators. Ultimately, things that are CISA rightfully called out in their zero trust maturity model. The problem, though, is that with all of those authenticators, it typically has to be some type of fallback. So you talked about it being fatigue. I talk about it from the perspective of maybe I'm just really absent-minded, and perhaps I have a token on my phone, or perhaps I have a YubiKey or something to that effect, and then I lose it. Well, now I have to go reassert and reestablish that identity. Depending on how your processes are set up, folks are either allowing you to do a very quick recovery with not much assurance that it is the right person, or they're making you go through a long, drawn-out process in order to reassert your identity. Identity verification, honestly, is like the path that is, if not protected, could lead to disruption or interception of most of the credentials that we see today. It's been put far too often to the back burner in terms of agency priorities and strategies in particular. It's because there's been this notion that, folks really only have to assert their identity once and we can manage it from there. Adversaries, fraudsters, they're getting more and more sophisticated. They're learning that as we deploy these new techniques, these new authenticators, they have to move upstream. So now my goal is to get earlier in the process. Why? Because not only can I now pretend to be John Gilroy and take the account from him before he even has the opportunity to get it, but perhaps I want to do some type of recovery activity. I can now steal it from him as part of the process. And so if we get identity verification right, we can keep them out holistically. If we get it wrong, then you're going to continue to see the stories that we see today where folks are being locked out of benefits, or they're having their benefits intercepted and taken from them ultimately.
Jordan, I can say unequivocally that no one on the planet has ever tried to act like they're John Gilroy.
There's only one. There's only one.
I guarantee you, your bank accounts, your credit cards, your 401k, you've had a lot of fraudsters trying to attack and take over those accounts. I guarantee you. You just don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure I'm right. I'm sure I'm right.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, Matt, you've got a military background.
That's right.
And so the military folks got this all locked in? This is only for civilian agencies? Or they got it all down? Or where do they fit in this conversation? They should have a bit better identity verification than others, shouldn't they?
Yeah, I think there's evolution there within the DoD space. Defense Manpower Data Center really runs a lot of the ID management for the DoD. They've done a good job. They've got a relatively secure credential-based system today of using smart cards effectively, which everyone that is on your podcast should understand. I think where they are working to evolve is around mobile-based credentials, more portable credentials, more flexible credentials, so that it's not carrying around your common access card as the only method of proving your identity to different resources. But I think the problem for people that serve is really when you get out of the military and then you have to prove that you had served at some point, you become a veteran. That was really, the starting point for when I had co-founded what is now ID.me, was around how do we solve that problem of giving people who had served in the military a way to continue to prove that they had served. And that's a big problem. That's a big challenge. But, I think our main focus today, because you can't boil the ocean in government at the end of the day, I think our main focus is really those agencies that have high constituent engagement, where they're providing benefits or services to the public, and they need to know that those benefits are going to the intended end recipient and not to organized fraud rings over in Nigeria or Russia or China, where we saw lots and lots and lots of taxpayer money going during the pandemic because it was so easy to commit identity fraud and use John Gilroy's information to fraudulently file for benefits from countries outside of the U.S.
So, Jordan, 1 hour ago, a gentleman sat in that chair at Ford's Fish Shack and recorded an interview, and we talked about network visibility. This is a challenge because the hybrid cloud, public-private legacy system is kind of a challenge. And he talked about dark data. So what do you mean? Well, there's a lot of data we don't know about on systems, so we can't really draw data from there. Now, in your article, you talk about the dark web. So what role does the dark web play in looking at vulnerabilities, especially when it comes to identity verification?
Yeah, and I think I talked about it a little bit. Think of it as like a clearinghouse, right, ultimately. Yep. If I'm looking to understand all the PI associated with John Gilroy or Matt Thompson or even Jordan Burris, likely in some way, shape, or form, there's pieces of that there, if not the wholesale thing. I was involved in the OPM data breach, and as a result, I know for a fact my information is out on the dark web or many of the other forums. Anytime I get a letter, I just say, okay, one more avenue where that's available. But even beyond that, it's not even just the data that may be available, it's the tactics and the techniques that are also being shared, right? So, one of the things that we promote within the cybersecurity community in the federal government is being able to share those, the TTPs, the tactics, techniques and procedures for vulnerabilities and how do we combat them. The same exact thing is happening, and perhaps maybe even at a faster clip on the dark web in particular. So when a fraudster or someone is engaging in an attack, they're sharing it in various forums to say, hey, this worked. This is how it was exploited. This is how you can go about replicating the exact same thing. They're sharing tools and making it more widely available. And in some cases, we're hamstrung because even beyond the federal government, if we start to look into state governments as well, that level of exchange is not taking place today. And so in some cases, we're fighting a battle with one arm tied behind our back. And for our adversaries or criminals that are out there today, they're using the dark web to continue to further their enterprise.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of the state attacks, because I'm going to California in August, and there's some counties in California that are bigger than some states.
Yep.
California alone is the size of a country. Just that aspect alone, that's all kinds of vulnerabilities there. It's really kind of shocking, and I think this is the new attack vector. Maybe they're going after, and they're going down the chain, down to the states and local communities and tribes, and there's so much going on there. It's incredible. Matt, at the beginning of this, I talked about the money. Show me the money. $5.4 billion, and I worry about my money and paying the government. And I think traditionally, and I don't want to cast aspersions on anyone's character, but it could be possible that the Small Business Administration, maybe other organizations, use a pay-and-chase approach. They may say, okay, Jordan, oh, yeah, we're going to give you that money, sure. And then it turns out that it's a fraud, and then they go after him rather than, no, I want to see that ID, I want to credibility, and this, and then a certified letter, and then a picture of your mom.
Right.
And so pay and chase is expensive, isn't it?
It is, and it's often, there often isn't much on the chase side or much success on the chase side. Yeah, and allowing this criminal activity to go unchecked, whether it's domestic or, international, is just not acceptable. I mean, at the end of the day, let's not care as much about how many billions or tens of billions or even hundreds of billions may have gone to fraudsters during the pandemic. And by the way, continue to go. We can't turn a blind eye to allowing fraud to be a cost of doing business with government, because it is funding criminal networks. It's funding terrorist activities. This isn't, money going to a mom and pop shop. Sure, some of it is, but the vast majority is going to organized crime rings, which, by the way, are taking this money and investing in their own R&D and getting better at attacking these different programs and services. And if you believe, as I do, as I think your audience does, we're only putting more services, more benefits online, not less, over time. And we're trying to push more and more things digital, which means that there's going to be more money available to fraudsters to continue to attack these systems. So we've got to do something. There's a lot of money being invested by the federal government and by many states now to modernize the way they're doing identity verification. And, at the end of the day, I think now, is the time for government leaders to step up and address this problem.
Well, Jordan, this is the part of the podcast where I read a statistic and you agree, disagree, or throw the microphone at me. So here's the statistic. 80% of cyber breaches are due to compromised credentials. That seems high, doesn't it? Is that a good figure?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's one of the number one attack vectors that are exploited today is identity. In particular, right? There's many ways identity can be exploited. We've outlined some of that as part of today's conversation, but the reality is that identity is ultimately the weakest link in the chain. It's one of the reasons why when I got started very early on in cybersecurity, doing risk management and understanding all the flaws, if you will, with a system, I kept coming back to identity and realizing that most of my problems, if I could just get that piece right, and it's a hard piece to get right, to be clear, it starts with identity ultimately.
Matt, crystal ball time. Look down the road. So where is identity management, synthetic identities? Where's this all heading in the next 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, I think as we get better, so are fraudsters, because as I just mentioned, they're also investing. So we've got to constantly be vigilant and innovating to protect the front door of our applications, whether they're government or commercial, to address this. But I do think this has been a big unsolved problem for government for many years. And I think we're getting the right leaders stepping up, the right investment being put into this space, the right focus on identity as critical infrastructure in America, that we will improve digital accessibility and we'll do a better job of mitigating fraud.
Well, great. That's a nice summary. We're running out of time here, unfortunately. You've been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Matt Thompson, Senior Vice President and General Manager of Public Sector Solutions at Socure, and Jordan Burris, Vice President and Head of Public Sector Strategy at Socure. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
This is George Teese from Elastic. Listen to episode number 65 of the Federal Tech Podcast, where I tell you everything you need to know about intelligent analysis.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.